Donald Trump views Palestinians as subhuman and therefore wants to oversee a mass ethnic cleansing, which would be one of the greatest crimes of this century.
Which is to dismantle the apartheid state, just as was done in cases other places around the world where racists, dictatorial, fascist regimes were brought down.
Hello, my name is Stanley Heller. Welcome to the Struggle Video News. I'm going to start by talking about a present. This was given by Netanyahu to Trump during the Israeli Prime Minister's trip to Washington. The Israeli press office informs us it's a golden beeper. It's a trophy of something Netanyahu is very proud of. The explosive beepers he got into Lebanon to Hezbollah forces that were detonated by Israel remotely on September 17th, 2024. It was an attack that former Defense Secretary Leon Panetta called terrorism. It injured 3,000 Lebanese. This is a picture of a Lebanese boy before he was injured by an exploding Israeli bomb inside a pager. I won't show you how his face was severely disfigured by the attack. But if you go to the Turkish news site TRT News, you can see a sympathetic video about the boy. A golden beeper. This is what the grinning, smirking excuse for a man Netanyahu thinks is a good idea for a present. All eyes on the West Bank. Though over 80 people in Gaza have been killed by Israeli attacks during the one-sided ceasefire, the center of Israeli forces have been attacking in the West Bank. Do remember that there was no October 7th attack from the West Bank. No hostages were taken by forces from the West Bank. That Hamas has a very small presence in the West Bank. It was the Israeli military that started the war against Palestinians in the West Bank. This is a photo of Saddam Hussein Iyad Rajab. He was shot near the very end of January. It took him 11 days to die. 26,000 people in areas of the West Bank have been driven from their homes by Israeli forces. Generally, being killed by one weapon is roughly as bad as another. But killing by poison gas has had a special horror for Jews ever since the mass gassings during the Holocaust. This is from an article in the Israeli dissident site 972 Mag, talking about certain Israeli bombings in Gaza. The gas stays underground and people suffocate. Israeli Brigadier General Reserve Guy Hazut, the only source willing to be named, told 972 in local call. We realized we could effectively target anyone underground using the Air Force's bunker buster bombs, which, even if they don't destroy the tunnel, releases gases that kill anyone inside. The tunnel then becomes a death trap. This recalls the end stages of the German suppression of the Warsaw Ghetto. Jewish fighters were hiding out in the sewer system, and German soldiers pumped in poison gas to kill them. And recall the words of the esteemed Jewish writer Masha Gessen, who in the fall of 2023 described what was happening in Gaza. She wrote, "The ghetto is being liquidated." about the proposal of President Trump that the United States take Gaza and engineer the expulsion of the Palestinians living there. We'll show you what Jewish writer Peter Beinart said on Democracy Now!
I mean, what we're seeing really is, at a macro level, is the question of whether you can do in the 21st century what you could do in the 19th century, which is to basically destroy entire populations of people because you view them as subhuman. Donald Trump views Palestinians as subhuman, and therefore wants to oversee a mass ethnic cleansing, which would be one of the greatest crimes of this century. And all across Washington, you hear people essentially shrug, or people say maybe it's impractical. I don't care. The question is not whether it's impractical. The question is whether we should be thinking about how we get Donald Trump in front of the International Criminal Court as a war criminal. This is one of the most monstrous things an American president has said in our time. And the fact that it can be assimilated like this is just testament to the profound dehumanization of Palestinians that suffuses American public discourse.
And this comment by Amy Goodman immediately following.
I have a question for you. Diana Buttu, the well-known Palestinian attorney, when asked about this, I mean, hours after President Trump made this announcement, talking about the demolition site that is Gaza, she said she agreed it's a demolition site. And about moving Palestinians, she said, well, the first point would be moving them back to their homes.
By homes, of course, Buttu was talking about all the places in 1948 Palestine from which Palestinians were driven out. An invite to a special webinar on Monday, February 10th at 7 p.m. Eastern to discuss the need to stop arming Israel and to talk about ways that might happen. Go to thestrugglevideo.org for details and how to register. Now, going back several months ago to the Palestine Museum US, where Mike Peled spoke. Peled was born an Israeli citizen, got the usual racist Zionist education, served in the IDF, and then a tragic incident changed his life and that of his family.
If you've seen my book, if you're familiar with my book, the book is titled The General's Son. And the subtitle is Journey of an Israeli in Palestine. And so the General's Son, it refers to the background that I had, the very Zionist, patriotic Israeli background that I come from. So not only was my father a general in the Israeli army, but he was of that generation of generals that Israelis adore. They're like the gods of the Olympus. They were young officers in 1948. They gave us the Israelis, us the Jewish people, however they frame it, independence and a state and so on. And then in 1967, that generation of brave officers were generals, and they led the Israeli army into what is considered, again, wrongly considered, I believe, a glorious victory of 1967. Not only was that part of my upbringing, but there were other members of my family who were instrumental in the founding of the State of Israel, and then the operating of the apartheid states from 1948, which is when it was established, all the way, for many decades. So at every dinner table, at every family gathering, that was the conversation: Zionism, the Jewish state; Zionism, the Jewish state, completely ignoring the fact, of course, that this was a deeply violent apartheid regime, pretending that this was some kind of an enlightened democracy. But of course, when you're born and raised that way, and you read about your father and other family members in textbooks in school, and you hear about it, everywhere you go, then there's a great sense of pride. And then, of course, the big question is always, so how did somebody who comes from that background, and I was very proud of that background. And if you read The General's Son, you'll see the first few chapters, that pride is expressed very clearly, which I know is very difficult for Palestinians to read. So how do you go from that to this? So there's two parts to the answer. The first one is that, sadly, we as humans change our perspective about the world and change our thinking, deeply thinking, our real belief system, we change it usually as a result of something that shakes us. Sadly, it's usually a tragedy that shakes us to a point where we have to re-examine everything we believe, we have to re-examine everything we've been told, and then we reach new conclusions, and then we're moved to take another path. And so in my case, as I think many of you know, in September of 1997, my sister lost her daughter in a suicide attack in Jerusalem. And that's precisely the kind of tragedy that forces us to rethink everything we know and everything we believe. And that was my case. And, violence in Palestine did not start on that day, obviously. But for me personally, and for people involved in my family, that was obviously a crucial moment, a pivotal moment. And what we tend to do is we tend to talk about violence in Palestine, and we just kind of list the attacks and list the victims and list the different dates and times and operations and whatever they wanted to call them, just as a list. And what I try to do is say, well, we shouldn't do that, because every single instance needs to be examined. And so once again, going back to my situation, looking closely at what happened on that day, on September 4, 1997, 3 young men took their own lives and took the lives of others at the same time. And to me, that is worth, we need to pause for a moment and let that sink in, just how horrible that is. And the question that has to be asked, and it is not enough, is what happened? What kind of a reality, what kind of an environment was created where these young men would do such a thing, where people would do such a thing? And the answer is, of course, the apartheid state, this violent regime that had taken over Palestine many decades before that happened in 1948, and has led to the point where this kind of violence takes place, where people do things like this. And it's very important, I think, to pause and let that sink in. And of course, there have been so many deaths since then, and so many horror stories since then, that we kind of tend to just gloss over. But I think it's important to take that in. And then I embarked on a journey, which again, the subtitle of the book, A Journey of an Israeli in Palestine, as an Israeli embarking into Palestine. The countries, if you've been there, how many people have been to Palestine? Oh, a lot of people. How many people, by the way, are from Palestine? Yeah. So almost everybody in this room is familiar with it. It's a very segregated place. So when you grow up, so the place that I grew up in, the country is Palestine, but I grew up in a very segregated colony within Palestine, in a bubble in which Palestinians really don't exist. They come in and out of the frame from time to time, but there's no reason to engage in them or know anything about them, and we don't know anything about them, and we don't learn anything about them. And their very existence is negated, is denied. Not only is their existence denied, but the horrific tragedy that was put upon them is denied. And that's how these colonies, that's how these spheres within Palestine, where people live supposedly a normal life, where there's always paved roads and green lawns and electricity and water as much as you need. Within this reality that was established in Palestine, where none of this, where people live an entirely different reality. And throughout this journey that I embarked on, of course, I met Palestinians, and that's the second part of the transformation. Meeting Palestinians, and I think this is true to many of us, many non-Palestinians, once you meet Palestinians, then everything changes. Once you engage with people in Palestine, the Palestinians, everything changes. And so that, again, that's precisely what happened with me. The first time I engaged in Palestinians was not even in Palestine. I was living in California, even though I was born and raised in Jerusalem. And they like to call Jerusalem a mixed city. It's not a mixed city. It's a segregated city, completely segregated city. And even as a child, I remember noticing that the Palestinians that I would see from time to time, they look different. They live a different life. Their neighborhood looks different. Their school, everything is different. And as a boy, of course, you don't know the word apartheid, but you realize that there's an enormous difference. And you know that you're segregated because you are segregated. There's no connection between the two sides. And then as the journey continued, at some point I reached, and of course many people reach this point where you have to make a choice. Because it turns out that this, robust education, Zionist education that I received, and all the stories and all the things that I heard from family members and so on, there was nothing heroic about them. They were part of horrific crime against an entire nation. So now, what does that mean? Where do I stand in all this? If I reject it, what happens to me as a person, my identity, and so on? And when I reached that intersection, it became clear to me that I had to pick a side. And the thing is with this issue, and this is why, again, it's so important to refer to the country as Palestine, not to hyphenate the name. You have to pick a side because one side is right and one side is wrong. It's not like the differences are nuanced or small detailed. One side supports apartheid, genocide, and a ruthless campaign of ethnic cleansing. The other side are on the receiving end of these crimes. These horrific crimes that are all crimes against humanity are being perpetrated against these people, against the Palestinians. And I purposely not use the word victims because I don't think Palestinians are victims. Palestinians are heroic. But these crimes have been perpetrated against them. So there was no way for me to continue to my life, my work, without rejecting the crimes and the source of the crimes. And the source of the crimes are this movement that's called the Zionist movement, and this apartheid regime that stole Palestine, changed its name, and established itself violently within Palestine. And then from that point on, the journey continued, and I began speaking more and meeting Palestinians more, and engaging more, and so on, all the way to the point where over the last couple of years, I've been thinking about living in Washington, D.C., and seeing there's no Palestinian flag in Washington, D.C. And there's no official building. And it's just, you see, in Washington, D.C., you've got embassies, you've got so many flags, you've got so many organizations and representing other countries, and Palestine does not exist. Even the organizations that are Palestinians are usually, they'll use an acronym, or they're in Virginia somewhere, or there's never a flag. There's never the name Palestine. So in talking to many Palestinian friends, both in Palestine and in other countries and in the United States, of course, we came to this realization that the symbolism of an existing high-profile space in Washington, D.C., with the name Palestine, with a Palestinian flag, is crucial. Because if we don't exist there, we don't exist. If Palestine doesn't exist there, it doesn't exist. And so that's really the short version of the journey of how I ended up, coming from where I did and speaking the way I do and doing the work that I do today.
Thank you. I guess the next step in this conversation is I would like you to briefly, let's just say 10 minutes, give us an overview of what you see as your vision for what should happen in Palestine and how do we achieve peace?
Okay.
If that's something that everybody wants to achieve.
Yeah. I noticed I have to shout out a good friend of mine that's tuned in, I guess, on Zoom from Palestine, Omar Hubari, who was part of an incredibly important organization in Palestine called Zochrot. And Zochrot means remembering, and it's part of an organization that's dedicated to the remembering and the commemorating, and indeed the return to the hundreds and hundreds of towns and villages that were destroyed by the apartheid state in 1948 and since. So I just want to shout out to Omar and to Zochrot. But I think that for a very long time now, the word peace has become something that nobody wants to discuss. How could we possibly talk about peace when all this, well, the reality is just so horrifying and so depressing? But we have to. We have to. The thing is, there's this misguided perception that peace means peace with the apartheid state, between Palestinians and the apartheid state. Well, just in saying that, I see people nodding their heads. That's an impossibility. The apartheid state is the source of the violence. The apartheid state is the source of, and I'll say this, and I say this with intent, the genocide that the Palestinians have been undergoing, for almost 8 decades. So if we want, and I believe we should all aspire and do everything we possibly can to bring peace to Palestine, but we have to realize what that means. To bring peace to Palestine, there are 2 steps. And by the way, this is not my vision. This is a Palestinian vision going back decades. I'm just, I'm relatively a latecomer to this vision, but it's a Palestinian vision, which is to dismantle the apartheid state, just as was done in other places around the world where racists, dictatorial, fascist regimes were brought down, and to allow for a free democratic Palestine to emerge on all historic Palestine between the river and the sea. And I have to say, people take issue with between the river and the sea, which is really, in my view, ridiculous, because Palestine exists between a river and the sea. None of us put it there. That's just the geographic, I spoke actually at an event in Albany, New York, at a library. And as I said it, one of the administrators of the library walked towards me, and we were sitting like this, very similar to this, and said to me, "You can't say that. You can't say that." And I said, "You can't say what?" He said, "You can't say the river to the sea." I said, "But that's Palestine exists geographically, between the river and the sea." So, I mean, it's really, it's an absurd conversation. But that's where this democracy needs to be established, a free Palestine from the river to the sea with equal rights. That is the only pathway to peace. That is the pathway to peace. And to that end, again, the Palestine House of Freedom is dedicated to educating people as to, first of all, the fact that that's the conversation that needs to take place, and that it's a hopeful, joyous vision, a free Palestine with equal rights, where people who live in historic Palestine of whatever religion they may have, whatever nationality, can live together in peace. Now, there's a new thing in Palestine now. Just like in South Africa, you have white Africans who are the children and grandchildren, descendants of settlers and colonizers, and are the result of a horrific apartheid state. In Palestine, we have Israelis. It's the same thing. We're the descendants of settlers. We are the result of the apartheid state, of the ethnic cleansing, and so on. But now that's a reality. There are Palestinians and there are Israelis. But that's different from accepting the regime and recognizing the regime. So once again, we have to embrace 2 things. Number one, that we have to get serious about dismantling the apartheid. We have to get serious about dismantling the apartheid state. A couple of years ago, 2.5 years ago, Amnesty International came out with a very thorough report, detailing the crime of apartheid and the way the crime of apartheid is being perpetrated in Palestine since it was established, since 1948. So don't listen to me, read the report. Read the report. So if I or almost anybody else says, well, there need to be sanctions again, there need to be sanctions imposed on the, you know, people say, well, you must be anti-Semitic. Why would you support sanctions and boycotting against the only Jewish state in the world and so on and so forth? Well, it's not about that. It has nothing to do with that. Sanctions and divestment and so on are the way we deal with the crime of apartheid. It's the appropriate response to this crime, which, by the way, is designated as a crime against humanity. It's that horrifying. It's such a horrible crime. So what we've done with Palestine House of Freedom over the last few months is we put out on social media, and it's in our website, parts of the report, parts of the apartheid, the amnesty report. Just read it. It's very simple. It's very clear. It details how the crime of apartheid is perpetrated in different parts of Palestine against different parts of the population. So Israeli Jews live under the same civilian law and have the same rights, regardless of where they live in Palestine. In Jerusalem, in the Naqab, in the south, in the Galilee, in the West Bank, it doesn't matter where Israeli Jews live, they're civilians. And their lives are governed by civilian laws. Palestinian lives are governed by different sets of laws depending on where they live within Palestine. Even within the population of Palestinians that are citizens of the state, of the apartheid state, there are differences.
That's our program for today. See you next week at this time. I'm Stanley Heller for the Struggle Video News.